One person involved has been murdered. Another died in mysterious circumstances. There have been beatings. There have been extractions by armed security personnel of people thought to be in danger.
My guest today is Matt Campbell. Matt is an award-winning reporter and editor for Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. His latest book, which he co-authored with Kit Chalel, is Dead in the Water, A True Story of Hijacking, Murder, and a Global Maritime Conspiracy. Dead in the Water is a shocking expose of the corrupt inner workings of international shipping told through the lens of one such hijacking and its aftermath. I recently sat down with Matt and we talked about the hidden system that powers seaborne trade, moving goods by tanker across the oceans of the world, and how terrible crimes can occur often with no consequences. Matt, thanks for coming on the show. I greatly appreciate it. I've been looking forward to it since I finished reading your book. Really, really great stuff, man.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, folks, the name of the book is Dead in the Water, A True Story of Hijacking, Murder, and Global Maritime Conspiracy. I want to tell you, I just flew through this book. It was like reading a fiction. Crazy.
That's what we were going for. My co-author, Kit, and I wanted this to read like a thriller. And the events it describes are kind of stranger than fiction in some ways. And so what we wanted to do was, turn this into something riveting, despite the fact that it's about, fundamentally the insurance industry, sort of improbably.
Yeah, crazy. All right. So I want to start from the beginning because not only is the hijacking and those who saw, Captain Phillips with Tom Hanks, how this really plays all into that. It's something somewhat similar in the same general vicinity of that in terms of what the story's about. But before we even go into that, what I found so interesting, and I think you write about it in the beginning of the book, we get our iPhones and virtually everything we wear, buy, clothes, this and that, through the ocean, right? Through big cargo ships going back and forth. And I think it's a $38 or $40 billion industry, ocean and coastal transportation, and very, very little is known of what goes on at the open seas. Is that more or less right?
That is more or less right. So, time was not all that long ago when a lot of people would have had a lot of exposure to the shipping business. If you think of New York City, the whole West Side used to be piers where, ocean-going vessels would load and unload. After the Second World War, it didn't take long for the ships to get too big. So in New York's case, the port got moved out to New Jersey. In London, what's now Canary Wharf was the main ocean-going port. That's all gone, of course. So one thing that happened was people just didn't see or really interact with shipping in the way they did before. Another thing that happened was the sailors who used to come from the U.S., from Europe, from the countries buying goods were replaced by sailors from places like the Philippines, Indonesia, India. And the other thing that happened, probably the most important, is the shipping business as a financial matter went completely offshore, all through a network of shell companies in places like the Cayman Islands, tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions, and employing things like flags of convenience, which we can talk about, which are kind of only in shipping, crazy legal arrangement that allows ship owners to get around a lot of regulation. And all these factors came together to make it so that it was just very hard for most of us to know anything about this industry.
Okay, so you met a lot of shady characters. You were, I don't know if you were threatened. I remember reading something, or they said, don't ask about this, and we'll talk about that in a second, what they told you. But is that more or less right? You were treading too close in certain cases, asking the right questions in the wrong areas?
So the case at the center of the book, which involves one vessel in particular, is one that has a kind of dangerous reputation. One person involved has been murdered. Another died in mysterious circumstances. There have been beatings. There have been extractions by armed security personnel of people thought to be in danger. So I think it is right to say that Kit and I knew we were in pretty uneasy territory in some cases. We were never directly threatened, although we were certainly warned we needed to be attentive to our safety. That said, the risk isn't really to us. We are, international journalists who work for a big media organization and have a public profile. Taking a pop at us would be pretty unwise on the part of whoever tried to do it. We were much more concerned about risks to our sources, which is something we did have to think about throughout this process.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. So the industry today, the global maritime industry, is huge. We can get goods from any part of the world. We're talking not only goods, but commodities as well. And this book centers around oil especially. And moving from point A to point B with very little regulation, out at sea, basically the law is the captain on the boat. And throw in something even better now, pirates, which cause havoc throughout the whole shipping industry. And then we tie in Lloyd's of London and the insurers into this, and you have the makings of a lot of problems, first of all, hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, and a lot of fraud with a lot of motivation for a lot of people because there's not that many consequences.
That's a pretty good sketch of it, actually. This is a huge industry, shipping, which is responsible, as the title of a great book about shipping had it, for 90% of everything. Basically, if you look around any room you're in, most of what's in there got to you on a boat at some stage of its journey. Air freight is a big business, but shipping is really where the bulk of international goods go. Container ships, oil tankers, obviously, bulk carriers that carry things like iron ore for steel or coal. So yeah, it is a huge industry. It's one on which we all depend. In the developed world, this is how we get consumer goods. In countries like China and Vietnam, Thailand, there have been millions of people propelled into the middle class because of cheap shipping. Because if there wasn't cheap and efficient shipping, manufacturing in those countries wouldn't be viable as a matter of exporting to North America and Europe. So, I think there is a temptation, certainly when I talk about the book, to discuss the evils of the shipping industry, and they are real. But I think it's also important to note that a big part of the modern world and many positive things about the modern world were made possible by the growth and the growing sophistication of the shipping business.
Okay, so your book focuses. Oh well, before we go with the boat that you talk about in the book and you frame everything around, is Captain Phillips, right? With Tom Hanks. That wasn't really Captain Phillips, but the real Captain Phillips. Just to share with us, what was he doing? They made a motion picture out of. What's it called? It's called Captain Phillips, right? Is that the name?
Called Captain Phillips?
Captain
Yeah,
Phillips.
that's right.
Give us a quick synopsis of that and how accurate and true that story was.
So that film was about a real incident, which happened, I believe it was 2008, where a vessel called the Maersk Alabama was hijacked by Somali pirates and really taken totally, who took control of the vessel, brought it to the Somali coast. Ultimately, there was a really dramatic rescue by U.S. Navy SEALs who were able to kill the pirates, rescue the vessel, and save the day, essentially. It was pretty accurate. I think events more or less unfolded as the film depicted. You hardly had to sex them up. I mean, it was a pretty amazing story. But it was not typical because piracy is a big problem. Currently, one of the hotspots is West Africa, the Gulf of Guinea. At the time, it was all about the waters between Yemen and Somalia, the Gulf of Aden, where Somali pirates were taking ships hostage, bringing them to the Somali coast and holding them for ransom. And, getting rescued by Navy SEALs is something that happened pretty much never, apart from the Maersk Alabama. What would usually happen is the ship owners, the cargo owners, or more likely their insurance companies would pay a ransom. And that's how they got back the ship and the crew. So where our book opens, which is in the Gulf of Aden in 2011, piracy was a huge problem. There were attacks, certainly every couple of days, not all successful, but many were. And success would mean a vessel being hijacked, taken to Somalia, and held for ransom. And this was a constant concern for the international shipping industry at the time because those waters are incredibly important. If you want to get cargo from Asia to Europe, from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, in other words, you need to go through the Suez Canal. And to go through the Suez Canal, you need to transit the Gulf of Aden between the Arabian Peninsula in the north and the Horn of Africa on the south. There was no way around it.
And why this specific area? Because of the lawlessness of these countries that pirates are able to act, kind of brazenly.
The thing to know about pirates is they depend on land. They depend on a hospitable environment on land. So in the kind of Johnny Depp Pirates of the Caribbean era, there were ports throughout the Caribbean where pirates could have safe haven. One of the reasons that we don't have piracy in the Caribbean anymore, or really in the Americas at all, is because those lawless areas no longer exist. There's nowhere for pirates to go where they won't be pursued by law enforcement. The reason that piracy thrived in Somalia and off the coast of Somalia is Somalia has been effectively a failed state for the better part of 30 years now, without much of a government, certainly in large parts of the country, and an environment where pirates could operate from shore pretty much with impunity. So those conditions provided the basis for piracy in the Gulf of Aden, and actually for pirates to get incredibly ambitious. I mean, some of these attacks were happening 300, 400, 500 miles out to sea, despite the fact these guys are in tiny little boats, sort of in mesh tank tops with rusty Kalashnikov rifles. They were very good at their jobs, and they did often succeed.
So when we think of pirates, before we get into the book and before we get into this one specific case which you talk about, which is boat, I just want, because it really opened up a whole world to me. You think of pirates, you think of, Johnny Depp kind of thing. But what's happening here, and I'm just remembering from Captain Phillips and just from reading and looking in your book and the pictures, because it really had the same type of craft that the Captain Phillips was in, this orange type of lifeboat that was encased and all.
That's right.
Yeah. So you have pirates in a speedboat with guns pull up beside a big, huge tanker, get on board by threatening the crew, by shooting, by what have you. They get on board, even though the ship might have barbed wire or have guards or what have you on that. Come over, commandeer the ship, take people hostage, and then steer the ship to Somalia, whatever. And it's the cost of doing business for these insurance companies just basically to pay the ransom. So it's a pretty good bet. You're making a lot of money when you do put, because it's time versus money for these insurance companies and for the ship owners. So you have a ship worth X million and you have to get your goods here. So these guys ask for a couple of $1 million. It's the cost of doing business, right? My question for you is this. You have a big tanker. How do these pirates get on the boat if the sailors on the boat are not complicit in some manner?
Well, they do manage. It does happen. There have certainly been cases where the sailors are complicit, and this book goes into that in some detail. But it's just a question of the physical reality of it, which is there is a way to get on to a large ocean vessel. You have to first catch up to it, and so the best thing you can do as a ship captain is just to go really fast and hope that you can outrun whoever's coming after you. There are also precautions you can take, like stringing out barbed wire on the decks. You can use fire hoses to try and blast intruders off the hull. But pirates have had a lot of practice, and they use things like grappling hooks to haul themselves up the side of these vessels. And once they're on board, the game has totally changed, right? The big challenge is getting on board.
Right.
Once you are on board and you are armed, and the crew, for the most part, is not, because crews generally don't carry weapons, although, in recent years, there has been some adoption of armed guards on ships. Once you're on board and you have the guns and the crew doesn't, you're in a much stronger position. as a pirate. So the whole game is getting on board, and after that, your odds improve substantially.
Okay, great. Okay, so we got the background on that, and that's what before even just reading your book gave me insight into the whole huge $38 billion industry. How many goods, and we didn't even get to the insurance part, but it's a very, very lucrative business to be a pirate, with little downside, right?
It certainly can be. I think it's probably more lucrative for the people who finance piracy than it is for the pirates themselves. I think if you are a mesh tank topped Somali pirate,
Right.
it's probably a pretty hard life. But something that has come out in the various law enforcement investigations that have been undertaken over the years is this is a big business. There are serious investors behind it who are funding pirate operations. The money then has to be laundered because that's the most important thing about any criminal enterprise is money laundering. And so there was certainly for a good long while a flow of pirate money into Dubai in particular. And once it's laundered into Dubai, it can then move into the international financial system. So yeah, this was a good investment, and that's what kept it going for as long as it did go, and today it continues in different parts of the world.
Okay, outstanding, great. So we gave a great background as to the whole business, how it's done, and all these ships have to go out insured. And so you have the insurance companies involved. They want to settle cases quick. They want to move on. You got owners. Perfect. Okay, now let's get right to the meat of your book. So July 2011, there's an oil tanker traveling through the Gulf of Aden, is attacked, and that sets the stage for some really nasty stuff and exposes a lot of really terrible things that go on. So pick it up from there, Matt.
So the central event of the book, the event from which everything else departs, was what happened to an oil tanker called the Brillante Virtuoso. The Brillante was, believe it or not one of the very largest oil tankers, but it was still pretty big, 274 meters long, which is about the height of the Chrysler Building. So just absolutely gigantic. Carrying cargo of fuel oil worth $100 million, give or take. It is traveling through the Gulf of Aden on the way from Ukraine to China when it is attacked by pirates. In the course of this attack, something unusual happens, which is there's an explosion and a fire. And I say unusual because, if you think about the pirate business model we were just discussing, you're trying to take something and hold it for ransom. You don't want anything to happen that's going to diminish the value of what you've taken. So if you're a pirate, blowing up the ship is a bad idea. Allowing a fire to get out of control is a bad idea. Nonetheless, that's what happens. And the ship stays afloat. It doesn't sink. The oil doesn't go up in flames. But it's essentially a total loss. It's a wreck. And in financial terms, it's a write-off.
Okay, hang on a second.
Yeah.
So it's $100 million worth of fuel oil, and the boat is insured for how much?
Between 70 and 80 million, depending how you calculate it.
So you're looking at around $180 million payday here that someone's insured, and if you have a crappy boat, it's not seaworthy, what have you, and if you can scuttle that ship, you're going to make $180 million, more or less.
That's pretty much the size of it. Yeah. There is a fair bit of insurance fraud in the shipping industry. This is something that's gone on since pretty much the dawn of time, certainly the dawn of finance. It's become more sophisticated and more ambitious over the years. But yeah, as you can imagine, when you have assets that are insured for huge amounts of money and at sea, a pretty lawless environment where it's easy to get away with stuff. Because nobody can see it, and the evidence might be at the bottom of the ocean.
Okay.
There are opportunities there.
Perfect. Okay, so I cut you into your story. Forgive me. So the boat is taken. It's unique here in the situation is that there's an explosion on that ship, which really starting to see doesn't make that much sense. And the ship is a total loss because now you have the salvage company come out and try to salvage the ship, and they get paid too, right? Because there's $100 million worth of oil destroying the coastline. So there's another incentive there. So the crew is rescued. Who rescues the crew?
It was the U.S. Navy in this case. They were picked up by an American cruiser.
Okay, so an American cruiser picks up interviews these people, I think they're mostly Philippines, right? Filipinos?
That's right. All 26 were Filipino.
Okay. All 26 are Filipino. And what's the captain doing during this time?
Well, the captain was held hostage by the pirates on the bridge. He was separated from the rest of the crew, as was the chief engineer. And this becomes important later on because there are some allegations made, fairly credible allegations, as to what the captain and the chief engineer might have been doing in that time.
Okay, so something smells a little bit rotten because you don't have a total 100% write-off. Sorry, write-off. 100% loss given these conditions. Just doesn't make sense so far, right?
That's right. It doesn't make sense. And what happens when there is a big marine accident is a lot of people get involved. This is a $180 million liability that lands in London at Lloyd's, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Lloyd's is the center of an industry, the marine insurance industry, which employs, many thousands of people all over the world. So this whole ecosystem snaps into movement when something like this happens. In this case, the big priority was to get somebody's eyes on the ship. The Lloyd's market needed someone to go check it out.
Okay, so that's the equivalent I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you have a claim on your house or claim on your car, an adjuster comes to size it up and tells the insurance company, look, I think this was fraud, or this guy really, had his house destroyed. So Lloyd's employs this one particular guy whose name is
David Mockett.
David Mockett, huge guy, 6'4", 6'5" or so, Englishman.
Something like that, yeah.
Big guy, and he's living in Yemen, right? And he's the go-to guy for these kinds of things, honest, credible guy. So he's the adjuster, if you will. I know he's not, but let's put it in a sense. He's the adjuster. We're Lloyd's of London. We want to get eyes on that ship to make sure, before we pay a nickel in claims, was this a real 100% loss? All right? So, right? Is that more or less, do I have it right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're called marine surveyors, but essentially what David is someone who does insurance adjusting just at massive scale, with huge marine accidents.
Okay, so this guy goes out on a boat. He gets wired from Lloyd's of London, I don't know who the contact was. Go out, check this out. He goes and checks this out. He looks at this boat, and what does he see?
He sees a story that doesn't make sense. He doesn't have a positive theory of what happens. He doesn't have an alternative explanation. He just knows that what he's seeing, what he's hearing about this apparent pirate attack and this explosion doesn't really stack up. And he's suspicious, and he shares those suspicions with people around him, both in Yemen, where he lived at the time, and back in London.
Okay. He sees, if I remember right, just correct me if I'm wrong here, he doesn't see any the explosion, which doesn't make sense, right? The holes, what do you call it? The bullets or what have you? Doesn't see punctures? Yeah. He doesn't see any of that.
Things he was told would be there were not. Basically, is the general statement.
Okay, so they're looking from these Filipino sailors, gave a story that's somehow not matching to the Navy, U.S. Navy, something is not matching up with what he's seeing with boots on the water in this case, right? Super.
Boots on the deck. Yeah, exactly.
Boots on the deck. Okay. Now sets in play a whole bunch of characters in the background who this guy is upsetting the apple cart, because from what I was learning about Lloyd's of London, these cases rarely get prosecuted because it's much easier to pay them off than to say that you're doing fraud, because it destroys your whole brand in the shipping industry. Is that right?
Yeah. One of the things in researching for this book that really blew my mind was learning that sketchy claims, claims that look like they might be fraudulent in marine insurance, get paid out all the time. And, it's kind of a variation of the old line that if you owe the bank $1 million, it's your problem. And if you owe them $1 billion, it's their problem. Right. If you intentionally blow up your bar, the insurance company's probably not going to pay you. But if you intentionally blow up a $100 million oil tanker, they just might. For a lot of reasons, which we can get into, but the incentives for them are generally to pay out, at least partially.
Right. They won't call you a liar. They'll just say something. They'll make a settlement, because the hazard to them is that no other shipping companies want to do business with them if they're not paying out claims.
Yeah, that's one. Not good for business to accuse your biggest clients of fraud. Another thing that the kind of more charitable explanation is there's a really high bar in the English courts, which is where these things get adjudicated, to proving fraud. And so you could spend a huge amount of money on a legal case and lose anyway,
Right.
because that bar is so difficult to reach.
Right. So it's so easy to just settle, pay them whatever they want, and they still make it. Okay, excellent. So this guy, David Mockett, right? David Mockett?
Yeah, that's right.
He files his report, and he's starting to see something doesn't make any sense. So pretty quickly, he gets into his car one day, and what happens?
July 20th, 2011, he has been in contact with a number of people about his findings, which are suspicious. He gets into his car outside his office in Aden, drives a very short distance, probably less than a minute, and is killed by a bomb that had been placed under the driver's seat, obviously intended only for him.
Okay. So now, and his wife she's living now in England, I believe, right?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, Cynthia Mockett.
Yeah, and something just seems totally off on this. And even from when this guy was really well respected, not only in the industry, but in Yemen as well, right?
He was. He was a local celebrity. There weren't a lot of expats in Yemen to begin with, definitely not at this time when things were getting really unstable in the Arab Spring. Initially, this was blamed on terrorism, which is kind of the obvious explanation at that time in that part of the world. But as they looked into it further, it became clear to the people who looked into this case that there was something else going on.
Okay, so to pick it up from there, what's going on here?
So what the insurers in London end up eventually accusing the ship owner, in this case, is of attempting a gigantic fraud. One of the most audacious, really, in the history of the industry. I won't get too much into the details, but the allegation, and it's one that ultimately proves to be substantiated by legal proceedings in London, is that this whole thing was cooked up in an attempt to defraud Lloyd's of London of a great deal of money.
Okay. And the guy behind this is, what do they call him? A little Mario? I'm sorry, what was it? Mario?
Super Mario.
Super Mario.
So the owner of the Brillante, is a Greek shipping tycoon named Mario Siliopoulos, who owns a bunch of oil tankers, owns a big ferry line in Greece. He's also a rally driver. So he competes in rally races, which are these kind of off-road, or not exactly off-road, but these very high-speed road races in souped-up cars. And he is ultimately accused by the insurers of being the mastermind of this fraud.
So he's accused of this fraud. There's a trial. At the trial, the judge, he's belligerent. He's belligerent on the stand. He's right. He doesn't even reckon. It's to him, it's totally alien. What are you, crazy? And there's everything, all the breadcrumbs lead to this being a fraud, right?
That's right. And yet he's never prosecuted, which is really interesting, and is, I think, to the great discredit of law enforcement in the UK, who would be the ones who would pursue this. He's never been charged. There has never been a serious criminal investigation of any of these events, including the murder of David Mockett. So there have been civil proceedings, though, and those civil proceedings did find that Siliopoulos was responsible for all of this.
So who's the whistleblower in this? Who spills the beans on all of this and gives everyone the inside of, wait a second, what was originally said when they were rescued by the U.S. Navy at the time of it are all fabricated?
Yeah, there were a few whistleblowers. The most interesting is a guy named Demetrios Plakakis, who was a Greek sailor who ended up being involved with this attempt to destroy the Brillante Virtuoso. And he later comes forward. He makes contact with these two private investigators who are working for the Lloyd's of London market. And, in a series of statements to the police and to others, Plakakis lays the whole thing out. And those statements end up getting disclosed in court, which provides really explosive evidence of the scale of this attempted fraud.
Which is just touch on a few of them. What was some of the fraud?
Well, essentially, that this whole thing had been planned in advance. That the pirates were fake pirates. They had been, hired to perform a job. First of all, they weren't Somali. Everyone thought they were Somali pirates. These guys were Yemeni. Um, they were, according to Makakis, actually off-duty members of the Yemeni Coast Guard who had been paid to create a kind of hoax pirate attack. And Similarly, Pakakis alleges with pretty good foundation that the salvage crews, the guys who attended to the ship after it was blown up, were all in on the whole thing, tipped off in advance. This statement that ends up getting disclosed, which I think is 60 or 70 pages, it's unbelievably detailed, is kind of the skeleton key to the whole scam.
And then you have this one of the sailors in the Philippines who he's a Christian guy and his conscience is bothering him, right? And he risks his life.
So you're referring to a guy named Alan Marquez, who was one of the sailors. He was actually the first sailor on the Brillante to see the pirates, and he was on the deck when they came on board. And I made contact with him years afterward in 2017, so 6 years after these events. And he told me that he felt terrible about the fact that he'd lied in the aftermath. He'd been told, he said, by Marios Iliopoulos, the ship owner, that he needed to tell a certain story. He'd been threatened. Alan said he'd been threatened by Iliopoulos, threatened with death, death threats were made against his family as to what would happen if he didn't tell the right story. But he said to me and later to others, because he was then interviewed as part of these legal proceedings, that, as a Christian, he didn't want to lie. He felt he had done something wrong and he wanted to set it right by telling the truth, which he did.
So now with all of this, we have a guy dead. We have David Mockett dead. His widow is in England now demanding justice, and there's no justice to be found. The trial takes place, and we see all the inner workings of Lloyd's of London, how it's more economical basically more economical to settle the case than to bring it to bring it to court. And why was this brought to court? Why wasn't this settled outside?
So there's a few reasons for that. One is this was an unusually large amount of money. $180 million in total is a big ticket, even at Lloyd's of London. Two was, I think the death of David Mockett did have something to do with it. Although the lawyers on the insurance side would say, no, it's not relevant. It's totally separate because they're arguing a civil insurance case. They're not arguing a murder trial. I think that did have something to do with their decision to fight. And generally, I think the audacity of this was so extreme that in this case, the Lloyd's market decided it was worth going to the mat over it.
Has anything changed in the, 10 years or so that this happened, 11 years, where there's more fraud, less fraud, more of these incidents, less of them?
In a word, no. This sort of thing still happens all the time. And the reasons it still happens are because the shipping industry's legal and financial structure remains the same. One thing that enables a huge amount of bad behavior is the fact that lots and lots of ships are owned anonymously. So even a vessel's insurers at Lloyd's don't necessarily know who the UBO, the ultimate beneficial owner, is. All they know is the name of the shell company that owns just that one ship. And that means, for example, that if you are a serial fraudster, the insurers you're dealing with may not even be able to draw lines between specific incidents and you. All they know about are these shell companies. And this plays out in other parts of the shipping world and other kinds of bad behavior. Anonymous ownership is a big, big problem. And I think until that changes, until governments, like the US, get serious about regulating shipping more intensely, these kind of misdeeds are going to keep happening.
You would think that with so much money at stake and how shipping is so vital to our economy, and we actually have our U.S. Navy men and women in this area risking their lives to protect sailors and ships, you would think, that should be a priority for somebody, right?
Well, it's not, and for the same reasons, actually, because all those arguments work the other way. Shipping's incredibly good at getting cheap stuff to American consumers, and the industry has argued successfully over the years that regulation slowing things down will be felt, on the shelves at Walmart. It'll be felt in the price tags at Walmart. After 9/11, there was this brief moment where the Bush administration, had a moment of real concern when they realized any container coming into Port Liberty in Newark could have a dirty bomb in it, for all we know.
Right, right.
We need to scan every container. Well, that took about 5 minutes before they realized that that's impossible, unless you want to gum up the entire retail supply chain. So, the kind of argument of the shipping industry is we do a great job getting stuff to consumers quickly and at a good price. And if you regulate us, we won't be able to do that anymore.
Right. So at the end of the day, Cynthia was the name, right? Cynthia Mockett?
Cynthia Mockett, that's right.
Yeah. So Cynthia Mockett's husband is blown to pieces. His body is in a zillion parts after the bomb exploded, and she never got a nickel. Right.
No, that's right. No compensation whatsoever, and she remains, as you can imagine, very angry at the way she and her family have been treated.
Yeah, I think you even mentioned that his own life insurance policy or something didn't even pay out or something to that effect.
That's right. Yeah.
So have you been in contact with her since?
Yes. Kit and I are in pretty frequent contact with her and some of the people who are helping her press her case, which she's still trying to do. She's pursuing this with the British government. Her member of parliament asked a question in the House of Commons about it, of the Home Secretary who runs all the law enforcement. But it's kind of a series of non-answers from the British government as to whether there will be real investigation.
So not only does crime pay, in this case, on a big scale, crime pays enormously well with, at the same time, very little downside.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the best moral of the story, but
that's what it is.
You can make good money doing bad stuff, and that's why people do it.
Wow, I'm not advocating for anyone to be a pirate, but it seems the incentives here are so large, and the prosecution is so slim to none, and the insurance companies just want to move on, and you have the anonymity of shell companies. It's not when I get a car, they have a whole history of all my driving records for a zillion years back. And if I ever tried, how many claims I put in, it's so automatic that there's no way, unless you change your identity, that you're able to get the rate that you think you should get, based on your history. They put together a premium based on your history. Here, it seems you're starting from ground zero every time. So you could have terrible people continually getting insurance from these backers and committing these atrocities.
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's a pretty good summation of it. And there's an interesting contrast, if you want to look at another global industry, with the airline business. And everything to do with airplanes is unbelievably regulated. And there's quite a lot of transparency, even around things like private jets. It's not always possible for the public to know who owns a private jet, but governments generally do. So aviation has had a real microscope put on it over the years, but shipping has totally escaped that.
Yeah, amazing, absolutely, and the coordination in the airline industry with countries, international, it's like seamless. It's just amazing how everything works together for the safety of the passenger. A plane goes down in Madagascar, the FAA is all over that as well, and then it trails right back to the manufacturer of the aircraft and a whole bunch of liability issues. Here, I don't want to say, but I'm just reading the book. I'm saying, okay, let's buy a tanker, scuttle it, insure it for $50 million, and settle for 20.
You want to do the insuring before the scuttling, but yeah, it's a
good
idea.
Well, I read the book. The salvage companies knew exactly when to get there before the ship even had a problem.
Yeah, and that's something that does happen. I think everyone assumes that goes on periodically, that salvage companies are tipped off, and are thus able to get to the scene of quote unquote accidents with improbable speed,
Yeah,
let's say.
and by the way, the money there was big also. I think the was a Poseidon, correct? The salvage
Yeah, they
was
were
it?
one of, yeah, there was another one as
Yeah,
well, but
it
yeah,
was
they were
$10
one of
million
them.
or so, right? They wanted a fee of
The
10 million.
salvage award was 30 million for
30
this.
million. Huge.
Yeah, because the way salvage works is if you run a salvage crew, you get paid a percentage of whatever value you save.
Wow.
And the percentage is not fixed. It goes, it's either you agree it or it goes to arbitration. And it could be 10, 20, 30%. So if you're talking about $100 million liability, it's pretty good money.
Which in this case was the oil and the environmental hazard that would have
Yeah, that's
that would
right.
have had.
Yeah.
Wow, wow, wow. All right. When did this book come out, Matt?
This book was published in the US in early May.
Early May. Have you heard from anyone in the U.S. Legislature or any politicians of any sort about this, or it's?
No, not yet. I certainly hope that we will eventually. There's a lot of other things on the agenda right now, but I do hope that this does become a priority for politicians in the U.S. and elsewhere at some point.
Yeah, I really hope so because it's just absolutely amazing how the human cost to getting your iPhone delivered by boat and having it, at a cheaper price than if it was flown here.
Exactly. Yeah, this is an industry that we all have the luxury of never thinking about. We don't think about who gets hurt by it. But those people are real. These misdeeds and crimes in some cases are real. And, I hope this book causes some people to pay attention.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is that, a few years ago, Walmart and the major big boxes that were manufacturing goods overseas made the manufacturers, they weren't manufacturing, they were buying, made these manufacturers have sweatshop laws, make sure that the factories didn't employ people, made them leave certain countries, certain areas, certain this. And here, no one really cares. Once you get that stuff on the boat, what happens to those poor sailors?
Yeah, it's amazing. I had someone who works in the kind of ESG space saying that to me, that big retailers spend huge amounts of time and money looking into the factories where their stuff comes from because no one wants to be supporting, slave labor or anything like that. But the steps in between are a total black box for them, and they haven't even thought of looking into that, which is kind of crazy.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, folks, the name of the book is Dead in the Water, A True Story of Hijacking, Murder, and a Global Maritime Conspiracy by Matthew Campbell and his co-author, Kit Chalel. Really well worth reading because I knew nothing about tankers. You get a great education in that, and by the end of the book, it's like, I can't believe all this, this is a great screenplay, by the way. Get that sold. I think it'll make really,
we do hope this will be on probably the small screen at some point before too long.
It makes an exciting story. Maybe it just really is an exciting story and an unjust one also, how, crime pays and pays big. So, Matt, great job shedding light on an area which 99% of the consumers don't even think about. At least they'll start thinking.
Indeed. Thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure, man. Thanks again. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Charles Mizrahi Show. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, we're glad to have you back. Either way, we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Reviews make it easier for others to find the show. You can also see the video of the interview on the Charles Mizrahi Show channel on YouTube.